different things like that, like things you would never think of, crazy stuff. We said yes a lot to mostly everything and everywhere.
A note before the script. The version of this story that actually happened is quieter than the word exposes suggests. There was no bombshell, no takedown, no scandal Richie was hiding for a decade. What really happened is arguably more interesting. A slow-motion breakup between two men who built something enormous together, followed by 10 years of silence. And then, in 2024, an actual apology, spoken on camera, to the band and to the fans. This script tells that real story. For 30 years, two names were inseparable. Jon Bon Jovi and Richie Sambora weren't just a singer and a guitarist. They were the reason a band from the working-class towns of New Jersey became one of the biggest rock acts on the planet. Then, one night in 2013, hours before a show in Calgary, Richie Sambora walked away and didn't come back. For over a decade, neither man said much of anything about why. Fans filled the silence with theories, a fight, a falling out, a rivalry gone sour. Then, in 2024, something changed. Richie Sambora sat in front of a camera at 64 years old and said the words fans had waited 11 years to hear. Not an accusation, an apology. This is the story of how two Jersey kids built one of rock's great partnerships, why it quietly came apart, and what Sambora finally admitted once he was ready to talk. Long before arenas and platinum records, Jon Bon Jovi and Richie Sambora were just two young musicians grinding through New Jersey's local scene. Jon came up in Sayreville, playing in a band called Atlantic City Expressway and later the Wild Ones. Richie was a few towns over, cutting his teeth in bar bands and wedding gigs, developing a guitar style built on feel as much as flash. Both were shaped by the same regional soundtrack, Bruce Springsteen's blue-collar storytelling, the blues records that filtered up from the South, the arena rock ambition of British bands like Led Zeppelin. Richie officially joined Bon Jovi in 1983, and it wasn't a small addition. He didn't just fill a guitar slot in an already formed band. His sound helped define what Bon Jovi would become. Where a lot of bands in that era leaned hard into glam metal theatrics, Sambora brought something warmer and more soulful, an emotional undertow beneath the big choruses. That combination, Jon's radio-ready voice and stage presence, Richie's bluesy, melodic guitar work, became the band's signature. By the time albums like Slippery When Wet and New Jersey turned Bon Jovi into a global phenomenon, the Jon and Richie partnership wasn't just a working relationship. Photos and footage from the era show two guys who genuinely liked each other, goofing around backstage, riffing together at soundchecks, carrying each other through the exhausting grind of arena touring. Richie has talked over the years about the sheer intensity of that era. Two guys from Jersey suddenly playing to tens of thousands of people a night, trying to hold on to some sense of normal life, while everything around them scaled up impossibly fast. But even in those best years, a hierarchy was forming, whether anyone meant for it to or not. Jon was the frontman, the face on the posters, the guy fielding most of the interviews, the name most casual fans associated with the band. Richie, despite co-writing many of the band's biggest songs and shaping their sound as much as anyone, settled into the role of the guy standing just to the side of center stage. For years, that arrangement worked fine. It's what happens next, as the band's success calcified into a business, and as life outside the band got harder for Richie, that the story gets more complicated. It's worth pausing on what Richie Sambora actually contributed, because it's easy for casual fans to underrate a guitarist standing next to a singer as magnetic as Jon Bon Jovi. Sambora's playing wasn't about pure technical showmanship. His solos functioned more like a second vocal line, phrases that answered or extended what Jon was singing, filling in the emotional blanks a lyric couldn't quite reach on its own. The talkbox hook on Livin' on a Prayer is probably the most famous 4 bars of his career, but it's really representative of his whole approach. A distinctive, almost vocal-sounding guitar tone used in service of the song, not just the player. He also had a strong hand in the writing. Songs like Wanted Dead or Alive, I'll Be There For You, and Never Say Goodbye carry his fingerprints in their structure and melody, not just their guitar parts. Musicians and critics who paid close attention to the band's catalog have long pointed out that Sambora was doing more than accompanying. He was co-authoring the emotional register of Bon Jovi's biggest hits. That's part of why his eventual exit felt so significant to longtime fans. It wasn't just a change in touring personnel. It was the departure of one half of the band's actual songwriting engine. By the late 1980s and into the 2000s, Bon Jovi had grown from a band into something closer to a global brand. Constant touring cycles, marketing machinery, an image to maintain. That kind of scale changes internal dynamics in almost every band that experiences it, and Bon Jovi was no exception. As Jon's profile as the face of the group solidified, the balance of creative input inside the band shifted with it. Sambora has spoken, in later interviews, about feeling that shift happened gradually rather than in one dramatic moment. He's described feeling like being physically present for rehearsals and recording sessions didn't always translate into actually being heard. That's a different kind of frustration than a single blow-up. It's the slower, more corrosive experience of feeling your influence erode a little at a time, without ever getting a clean moment to address it. That professional strain didn't arrive in a vacuum. Sambora was also dealing with serious personal difficulties during this period. Struggles with substance use that he's spoken about candidly in interviews, and the emotional fallout of his divorce from actress Heather Locklear, with whom he shares his daughter, Ava. A touring schedule that never really slows down is a hard environment to work through those kinds of problems in. Bandmates who are also your employers, in effect, aren't always positioned to offer the kind of support someone going through addiction and divorce actually needs. By his own account, none of this played out as some public war of words. There was no tabloid feud, no dueling interviews. It was quieter than that, a friendship and a working partnership that wore down gradually, while the band kept touring and the machine kept running. In April 2013, hours before a scheduled Bon Jovi show in Calgary as part of the Because We Can Tour, the band announced that Richie Sambora would not be performing. The official reason given was personal reasons. No further detail, no timeline. For a band that had built its identity partly on the visible chemistry between its two central members, Sambora's sudden absence was jarring, and it triggered a decade of speculation. At first, many assumed it was temporary, an illness, a family emergency, something that would resolve itself within weeks. It didn't. As the tour continued without him, and the band eventually brought in guitarist Phil X to fill the role, it became clear this wasn't a short-term situation. Sambora didn't return to the band's lineup. What actually pushed Sambora to that point, by his own later account, was a combination of exhaustion, physical, emotional, and creative, and a growing sense that he needed to step back for his own well-being and for his family. He said the environment around the band had become difficult for him personally, and that he felt increasingly sidelined in a project he'd helped build from its earliest days. He's also been candid that the way he left wasn't the way he wishes he'd handled it. There wasn't a conversation with Jon beforehand explaining his decision. He simply didn't show up, and the fallout from that unfolded without him in the room. The reason Sambora has returned to most consistently across multiple interviews in the years since is his daughter, Ava, whom he shares with Heather Locklear. Ava was entering her teenage years around the time of his departure, and Sambora has said that his constant touring schedule was creating real distance in their relationship. Distance he didn't want to let continue. He's also spoken about the difficulty of that period for Ava specifically, given her parents' high-profile divorce and its accompanying media attention. The reaction from fans at the time was genuinely split. Some felt Sambora had abandoned the band and the tour irresponsibly, walking out on obligations to bandmates and fans alike. Others, once more of the context became public, saw a musician making a difficult but understandable choice to prioritize his kid during a hard stretch of her life. Either way, Sambora has been consistent in framing his decision as fundamentally about his role as a father rather than a rejection of the band or of Jon personally. What followed Sambora's departure wasn't a public feud. It was closer to the opposite, a long stretch where neither man said much of substance about the other, and where the band's internal history became one of rock's more talked-about unresolved stories. There were no dueling, tell-all interviews, no public shots fired. Jon largely kept his comments about Sambora's exit brief and focused on moving the band forward with its new lineup, while continuing to tour and record. That absence of public drama didn't mean the situation was resolved between them personally. By multiple accounts, Jon and Richie went a significant stretch of time without speaking directly. The band story continued in public: new albums, new tours, a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2018 that briefly reunited the classic lineup on stage, while the actual relationship between its two most central figures stayed largely private, and, for much of that decade, distant. The real turning point came in April 2024 with the release of the Hulu docuseries Thank You, Good Night, The Bon Jovi Story. The series brought together Jon Bon Jovi, keyboardist David Bryan, drummer Tico Torres, and notably Richie Sambora, to tell the band's 40-year history in their own words, including the parts they'd avoided discussing publicly for over a decade. In the documentary, Sambora finally addressed his 2013 exit directly. He said he didn't regret the decision to step away, but he did regret how he handled it, the abruptness, the lack of a real conversation with his bandmates beforehand. He used the moment to apologize, both to the band's fans and to the guys themselves, acknowledging that the way he left had left people confused and, understandably, hurt. He's described the emotional weight of that period in blunt terms, saying at the time it felt like the only way he knew how to get out was simply to disappear. He also filled in details that had never been public before, that he'd been in and out of rehab in the period leading up to his departure, that Heather Locklear was dealing with serious mental health issues around the same time, and that his daughter needed him in a way that made staying on the road increasingly untenable. None of this was framed as an attack on Jon or the band. It was framed as an honest accounting of a genuinely difficult chapter of his life that he'd kept mostly private for over 10 years. Jon Bon Jovi's response, once the documentary brought the subject back into public conversation, was notably measured. He's been clear in multiple interviews since that there was no fight that drove Sambora out, no blow-up, no confrontation. What he has acknowledged is that the band was blindsided by the timing and manner of the departure. He's described the band as angry, disappointed, and shocked in the moment, since nobody expected Sambora to leave the way he did. He's also said he stopped speaking with Sambora for a stretch after that. At the same time, Jon has consistently rejected the idea that there was ever real animosity between them. He's pointed to Sambora's personal circumstances at the time, the substance abuse struggles, the anxiety, the demands of suddenly being a more hands-on single parent, as context that made the departure understandable, even if the way it happened was jarring. By his own account, he and Sambora watched portions of the documentary together at his house before it aired, which suggests a relationship that, whatever its distance over the years, hadn't curdled into bitterness. Jon has also been open about his own major challenge during this same broader period, a serious vocal cord surgery in 2022 that forced him to rebuild his voice and rethink what touring and performing could look like for him going forward. That process has clearly shaped how he thinks about the band's future, including any conversation about Sambora's potential return. This is the part of the story most fans actually want an answer to, and the honest answer is, it's genuinely uncertain, but not off the table. Sambora himself has said, in interviews following the documentary's release, that he'd be open to returning to the band, framing it as something fans would embrace. Jon, for his part, has avoided ruling it out, using phrases like never say never when asked directly, while also making clear that any decision would have to wait until he's confident in his own vocal recovery and stamina for the physical demands of a real tour. There are real practical obstacles beyond sentiment. Jon has been explicit that returning to a full touring schedule depends on rebuilding the vocal stamina to perform a full set multiple nights a week, something his 2022 surgery and recovery have made anything but guaranteed. Sambora, for his own part, has talked about being more selective these days about what he takes on physically, given how demanding touring life can be. Beyond the physical logistics, there's also the simple fact that both men have spent over a decade building different creative lives. Jon steering the band toward a more mature adult contemporary sound, Sambora leaning into blues and solo work shaped by a different, more personal phase of his life. None of that means a reunion is impossible. It does mean that if one happens, it's likely to come from a place of genuine readiness on both sides rather than pure nostalgia, which, if anything, tracks with how both men have talked about the band's legacy in recent years. Neither seems interested in a reunion built only on fan sentiment rather than an actual shared desire to make it work. In the years since 2013, Richie Sambora has built a life that looks different from his decades inside Bon Jovi's touring machine. He's spoken openly about going through therapy and reckoning honestly with the choices he made, including the abrupt way he exited the band. Much of his focus has shifted toward his daughter Ava, whose own career has started to take shape, and toward more personal, lower-key musical projects, occasional performances, solo material, a pace of life that prioritizes stability over spectacle. Jon Bon Jovi, meanwhile, has kept the band moving forward, releasing new music and touring with the current lineup as his vocal recovery allows, while being noticeably more reflective in interviews about the band's history and his own mortality as an artist. He's spoken about the band's legacy in terms of what they built together in their prime rather than trying to recreate it note for note today. What both men seem to agree on, even without a full reunion, is that the history they share is real and doesn't need to be erased or relitigated to be honored. Sambora has talked about the pride he still feels in the music they made together, and Jon has been consistent in saying there's no animosity between them, even during the years they weren't in close contact. That's a far less sensational story than Expose implies, but it might be a more honest one. Two guys who built something enormous together, went through a genuinely hard stretch that pulled them apart, and eventually found their way to an honest conversation about what happened. Even if the full reunion fans want is still an open question. If you want, I can also put together a shorter, punchier cut of this for a video's actual voiceover pacing, or break it into timestamp sections matching a specific runtime.